Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do something a little different. Welcome to Aztec Ruins National Monument, a small park located within the Four Corners region just outside of the cozy town of Aztec, New Mexico. The site of Aztec Ruins is situated just about halfway between the more well-known parks of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. So built in the early 1100s, this place wasn't built by the Aztecs. Don't let the name fool you. It's actually built by the ancestral Puebloans. That name is brought about because of the Spanish. They just kind of named everything Aztec. That's why we have Montezuma's Well and a bunch of other things like that, Montezuma's Castle. They just kind of named everything Aztec. But this is actually the ancestral Puebloans. And the ancestral Puebloans took up a huge chunk of what we now call the Four Corners. So it's massive civilization. And at their core was Chaco. And from Chaco, that's where a ton of trade was coming in and going out, and roads and everything. It's a really huge civilization, and a very, well, impressive one. Welcome to the reconstructed Great Kiva at Aztec Ruins. And I know what you're thinking. Didn't you just yell at somebody for sitting on the ruins, and yet here you are doing the same thing? Yes, I did yell at them for that. But here's the difference, the big difference. This is a reconstruction. And when they reconstructed this, they coated it with a nice hard, probably cement shell. They also painted it so that people could see what it looked like. And the reason for this is so that people can touch it, can sit on it, and you're not damaging things. With that being said, however, the raw stone, yeah, we don't want to touch that. That will damage it. As for the Great Kiva, let's go ahead and talk about what it took to build this place. When they first opened the park, this here wasn't reconstructed. This was actually a big hole in the ground, and I'll put a picture up on the screen so you can see what it looked like. And it was basically the features. You could look down into it and see sort of what it sort of looked like, the footprint. But they ran into a problem. Within the first year or two, with rains and erosion, the walls sort of just caved in, and this became pretty much unrecognizable. As archaeologists, we have this rule in archaeology that natural forces act the same way now that they did back in the day. So what that means is rain always falls from the sky, water always flows. And we can assume then that when the people were building this in the first place in the early 1100s, that they were running into the same problem, that they had to build this really quick. Otherwise, it would just sort of cave in. The other problem that you run into is that it snows out here, and you don't want to dig in frozen ground because, well, it's hard and it generally sucks. So you probably want to wait till the first frost comes around, and you probably want to be done by the time the monsoons come around, because if you don't have a roof on this place or walls, well, you just end up with a big kiddie pool. Now, I know it's hard to see from there, but the ground level, I'll show you with my handy dandy pointing stick, is right about here and here, this line. About 8 feet in some places, 9 in others. That's straight down. The Great Kiva is also 41 feet across from wall to wall. That's a pretty big hole. And I want you to think about this. If you were to build one of these in your backyard, how would you do it? Would you get a contractor? Probably. Would they have backhoes? Yes. But they didn't have backhoes back then. So it'd be like you and a bunch of buddies wanting to dig this hole out in your backyard. You'd probably use shovels, and it'd probably take a long time. But they didn't have shovels like we did. They had these. This is a digging stick. And this is what they used to dig this hole out. 41 feet across, 8 feet down. And they had to do it in a very short amount of time. That's a lot of people. But the amount of people that held these digging sticks wasn't all either. For every digging stick, there was also somebody with a basket transporting sand out, and dirt out. And so for the amount of people that you would imagine it would take to dig this entire place out with one of these, multiply that number by 2. But once you have the hole dug out, you got to put a wall on it. Now, you saw the shot from outside. It's about, I don't know, about 10 feet up. So between 8 to 9 feet down, 10 feet up, above the ground, of course, you're looking somewhere around 20 feet because there's a little bit of a lip that sticks up. And that's a lot of material to transport. And the material they're using is this. This is a sandstone block quarried from about 3 to 4 miles away, upwards of about 7 miles away. And they basically just knock these things out of a sandstone canyon and shape them by hand, and then transport them here. And I know what you're thinking, probably pretty easy to transport, you know? You just throw them, a bunch of them on, in a bag on a horse and bring it here, but horses weren't here. No. Horses were a New World thing. Those came with the explorers that came to the New World. They didn't have horses. Matter of fact, they only really had 2 domesticated animals. Dogs, which were smaller dogs and weren't going to pull a sled with those, and turkeys. And let's face it, you can only put so many turkeys on a sled before it gets a little crazy. No, they carried these for miles to bring them around. And then when you look at the walls, that's a lot. We're not talking about hundreds of blocks. We're not even talking about thousands of blocks, because the entire complex, not just this room here, not just this Great Kiva, the entire complex has over 400 rooms, 3 stories, possibly even 4. We're talking about millions of blocks. And these things are about 10 to 15 pounds a pop. This is about average for a block. That's a lot of manpower too. These people were very, very dedicated to building this. This roof is 95 tons. Supporting it are these 4 pillars here. Now these are a little bit bigger than they actually were in history. They were about 2/3 the size of this. But the construction of these pillars is pretty interesting. You see, as we walk around the ruins and you look at some of the walls, you'll start to see things like cracks. And that's because the way that they constructed it, it's sandstone with mortar. And you can't construct these pillars like that, because if they crack, well, then the whole roof comes down. And the roof being 95 tons with no rebar or anything like that that we would expect to see in a modern construction will flex. Some years it may be really wet. Some years there may be a lot of snow. At 41 feet across, the weight may be unevenly distributed, but it will always be pushing down on the pillars. And if you have a hole here that's dug out by digging sticks, 95 tons across these pillars, they're going to sink. So what they did was something really interesting. These are limestone discs. They're about 350 pounds a pop, and they're quarried from about, I think, 17 to 14 miles away from the north. Looking at them, they're round. You might expect them to roll them all the way here, but they didn't. They carried them. That's a lot of weight. Each one of these pillars has 4 discs underneath them in the bottom. Now granted, these don't. These are modern constructions. But if you were to put just the discs down in there, well, it's not going to give you much, because there's no real compression that they can do. I mean, it's stone on stone. So what they did is they actually sandwiched a softer stone in between called lignite. And what lignite is in the sort of evolution of peat to coal, it's somewhere in the middle. I'm not a geologist. But what happens is, as weight increases on the pillar with that lignite sandwich in between here, you get some compression. That allows the roof to flex without cracking the pillars, or without really cracking the roof when you think about it. It doesn't flex a lot, just a little bit. But up and down motion isn't the only motion that we need to account for. Side-to-side motion is another issue that they're going to have to combat. And this is how they did it. See, the walls are constructed with just sandstone and mortar, like I mentioned before. But for the pillars, they stuck these pieces of wood in between. and they crisscrossed them as they went down. The wood in between the blocks give it a little bit of squish and compensates for the very slight side-to-side motions, both this way and that way, allowing the pillar to retain its structural integrity. Now, this kind of technology we wouldn't see again until the mid-1900s, when we started building buildings in earthquake-prone areas and started doing things to allow them to flex. These people were doing it 1,000 years ago. Now, in some of those shots, you might have seen these and wondered just what the heck these are. Well, we call these floor vaults, and if you're wondering what the function of them is, well, we're not really sure. There's a lot of theories out there, but we're not going to ever really know for sure. And the reason being is because at the end of the ancestral Puebloans' big civilization, they all dispersed. And when they settled in their own areas, their culture evolved separately from each other. And granted, it's still the same culture, but things might be a little different nowadays. So if you talk to someone from one Puebloan tribe, they might tell you what this is used for in one way, but another one might tell you something completely different. One of the ideas that I like is that these were used to start plants. You see, corn needs 121 frost-free days to grow, and out here, well, sometimes we don't get that. You see, these might have been used to start seedlings because this room can have its temperature stabilized pretty easily. I mean, we have a hearth with a fire. But the other neat thing is the smoke hole in the ceiling. You see, that casts light down onto the floor. And in the early spring, in the morning, if it were rectangular, it would actually fill this whole floor vault. And in the afternoon, around 2 or 3 o'clock, it would fill the other floor vault as well with light. So I like that one. However, we'll never really know for sure. Let's talk a little bit about this. This has been called a throne. It has been called an altar. But really, we don't know what it was. And I have a little bit of a problem with archaeology naming conventions. Because if we call this a throne, there's a very specific image that comes to your mind. One of kings and queens, which weren't really a thing with the ancestral Puebloans. And when we say altar, there's other images that come to mind, like animal sacrifice, human sacrifice, which also wasn't a thing in the ancestral Puebloan world. What is this? We're not really sure. But a throne and an altar, we can be sure it was not. The Great Kiva wasn't the only kiva that was rebuilt. This one was rebuilt as well, but this one suffered worse fate than the original hole, that one, but something along the same lines. You see, this had a problem with flooding, and the roof eventually started rotting out, and they had to take the whole thing down. So when you come out to a place like this, when you come out to Aztec ruins and you look at this, you'll notice that the walls are nicely built, and they're nice and flush. You'll notice that the faces of the sandstone down inside the kiva are nice and flat and have been dressed, but above it, well, you get a lot of river rock and things like that. And that's because that was originally hidden. You would have never seen it, and they never thought anyone would have ever seen it. But, well, here we are. This kiva here in the complex can tell us a lot of really interesting things about the people here. When you're here and you look at the walls and you look at the bench that goes around it, you'll notice that the blocks are significantly smaller than the rest of the blocks used in the complex here. And the reason for that is because it's an earlier construction. You see, this type of construction we call Chacoan construction. And we call it that because, well, you find it out at Chaco, and archaeologists aren't that creative with naming things. Well, what does that mean when we look at the rest of the complex and we look at sort of the timeline of events? Well, this particular kiva and some of the surrounding rooms around it was probably here before this whole complex was here, which means this area was a place that people were living and doing their daily lives well before the decision to make this giant complex. From the earliest construction now to the latest construction. Just below the kiva that we were just at are some rooms that have been added on later on in time. You'll notice the construction here. You've got the big blocks, the smaller blocks, big blocks, sort of these stripes. But then when you look at this, it's nothing but big blocks and a lot of mortar. This is what we call Mesa Verde construction because it's found in Mesa Verde. I mean, we're really not that creative. But that's how you can tell that these have been added on, because there is no layering when it comes to the blocks with this wall and this wall. They literally just plastered this thing on here. Ah, T-shaped doorways. The great mystery. Why did they build them this way? What were they used for? There's a lot of theories about it. The one that I like, that I love to debunk, is, well, if you're carrying stuff, you can walk through, because if you got something that you're carrying up high, well, you know, it's up here. Bundles, things like that. Which would make sense. However, T-shaped doorways are really only out towards the front. Storage is usually always in the back of the complex, so you would think that if it was for carrying things to storage, that it would be all the way back, but it's not. If you ask me my opinion, I don't know. I don't know. They look cool. One of the things I love showing people when they come here is the future planning that the ancestral Puebloans put into building this place. They knew things were going to break, they knew things were going to rot, and they built it in such a way to where they could easily repair it. Case in point, when you look at this wall, you'll notice all these holes, and you'll see some sticks coming out. Now these sticks go on top of the beams, the roof beams. On top of that, they put other things, and then they make the floor. But what's important is they have holes on this end that they're sticking those sticks into. Let me show you the other end. On this end, no holes, only a shelf. So those sticks would come across, branches or whatever, and they would lean, or they would rest on this shelf here. Now, why is that important? Well, those smaller beams rot and they break. And if you had holes on both ends, well, pulling one out to replace it is kind of a pain in the butt job. But if you have the shelf, well, you just take the broken piece off, put a new one on, lash it together, good to go. Future planning. Very smart. We're about to go in through the north rooms, and you'll notice these doorways here. One thing to keep in mind, these are not the original doorways. Matter of fact, the truth behind these doorways is a little disappointing. You see, these are actually pot hunting holes that have been just opened up a little bit more and shored up to make them doorways. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, this place was hit by people pot hunting. And they broke in through the ceiling, came into these rooms, and just started pushing their way through, not really caring what they destroyed. But ever the innovators, the Park Service shored up these doorways, and now we can go into the north rooms. The great thing about the north rooms is that these are the original ceilings. These are the original roof beams from 900 years ago. All along these roof beams, you'll see plugs where they did dendrochronology analysis. That's how we know when this place was built. But what I want to call your attention to is just how big these beams are. Some of these are 30 feet long, some of them up to 2 feet wide. Now, if you wanted to build one of these in your backyard, you'd probably use a chainsaw to cut down this wood. But they didn't have chainsaws, obviously. So the next option would be an axe, but they didn't have those either. No, what they had was this, a stone hatchet. Now, some of these beams are 30 feet long and some of them upwards of 2 feet in diameter. And what's even crazier is where they got them. You see, some of the wood that's in the roof is from Durango, which is about 20-30 miles north. but some of it is from the Chusca Mountains, which is farther away. And they didn't float these down the river to get them here. Oh no, oh no, they carried them. So I mentioned that the doorways we walk through are not the original ones. That's because these are the original ones. Now, when you look at it, they're kind of small and they're up off of the ground and real low. So you might be tempted to say that the people that lived here, or the people that used this facility, were really short, but they weren't. They're actually not that far off from where we are today. Average height for a male was around 5'7". I'm 5'7". I can fit through this just fine. The construction of this, though, is what's important. You see, in these rooms, the temperature is fairly consistent year-round, somewhere around 73 degrees. And they get that from the way that these doors are constructed. You see, the threshold of the door is above the ground, which means that cold air, when it sinks, gets trapped down low. So in the summer, it's nice and cool. And the top is below the roof. So in the winter, hot air rises and gets trapped. It's sort of like an early environmental control system. The north wall is pretty interesting as well. You see, this, we're pretty sure, was the first thing built here. The reason for that is because it lines up with the solstice, both the summer and winter solstice. You see, the ancestral Puebloan were agricultural people, and when your life depends on agriculture, you need to track the seasons. And what better way to do it than with this place? Now, I know this isn't the content that you're used to. I mean, I haven't even mentioned the ancient Greeks the entire time I've been here, but I felt like I needed to put this out here. I mean, this was the first park I ever worked at, and I've come back a couple times in a row to work here again. And, you know, up here at the overlooking the whole site, it's no wonder that this place became a UNESCO World Heritage Site back in the 80s. And there's a lot more stuff I could talk about. I mean, what we've talked about today is only a fraction of the giant iceberg that is Aztec ruins. So what I would suggest, go to their website. If you're in the area, make this a stop. I think you'll enjoy it. Wait, I gotta do my outro. And until next time, see you then. Are you recording? I am. Okay. And sort of, I'm trying to think, holy shit. What's the word I'm looking for? Oh my God, I just had a total brain fart. In a room that could stay, oh my God, what's the word I'm looking for now? And the Great Kiva is 41 feet across. Now, and there's this thing in archaeology where we think, God damn it, why do I keep saying thing? Sort of like a early central air. No. What do you call that? Environmental control. That's really all I want to say about that.